Welcome, everyone. Let me add my welcome to those who've joined since the beginning of the service. It's great to have you with us. My name's Dan. I'm pastor at this church, and it's going to be my privilege to share a little bit from that reading which Anna has just read for us. And let me just share, earlier on, as Paul said, we had a service over in the church building for the first time, a Sunday service, and it felt different, but it was good. And it was lovely to be able to gather together to worship. But we're obviously committed to carrying on streaming online. So that those who are unable to get out of the home or unable to fit into church are able to join us in worship. And wonderful to have the band videos this morning. And for the first time, you'll see that we were able to get the band into church, socially distanced, to record the song. And so that was a better experience for them, being able to worship together rather than just sort of have to record individually, listening to their headphones and so on. Now, one of my many claims to fame, or possibly my only claim to fame, is that when I was at school, I played in a band with Johnny Lee Miller, who went on to become a famous actor. He's appeared in Endgame and Emma and won a Laurence Olivier Award. He was even married briefly to Angelina Jolie. And his first starring role was as Sick Boy in the 1996 cult film Trainspotting. Now, I know that will be before some of your time, but at the time, loads of people had a Trainspotting mug or a Trainspotting poster on their wall, including a long, famous quote from the film. It says this: "Choose a job, choose a career, choose a family, choose a big television, choose washing machines, cars, compact disc players, and electrical tin openers. Fixed interest mortgage repayments, leisure wear and matching luggage, a three-piece suite on hire purchase. Choose DIY and wondering who you are on a Sunday morning. Choose sitting on that couch watching mind-numbing, spirit-crushing game shows, stuffing junk food into your mouth. Choose rotting away at the end of it all, living your last in a miserable home, nothing more than an embarrassment to the selfish brats you have spawned to replace yourselves. Choose your future, choose life." Now, that's the clean version of the quote, but it's a pretty bleak sort of appearance of what life is all about. But what Anna has just read for us is the Bible's version of a choose life speech. It finishes exactly the same way: choose life. And it's tucked away towards the end of this Bible book called Deuteronomy. And there's been chapters and chapters of rules and regulations, most of which seems outdated and irrelevant. But then comes this blistering climax as Moses urges the Hebrew people to choose life. And you see, they'd been in a lockdown of sorts for 40 years, wandering around as a bubble, as a nation in the desert, as they waited and waited and waited for the right time to enter the promised land. And when they did enter the promised land, the land which they knew held such huge potential, and it was going to be new freedoms and new opportunities for them. Doubtless some of them were really scared about going into that new land and all the change there would be. Doubtless some were really excited and looking forward to the possibilities. And I guess we're in a similar situation, aren't we? It feels like we're on the verge of a new era. Some of us are really excited about it. Some of us are really nervous and scared about it still. This new era is beginning to come, isn't it? The other day, I had 5 face-to-face meetings in one day. And then I saw some relatives we hadn't seen since before lockdown in the evening. And as more of the shops open up and people go to the pub more, and as more of the restrictions begin to lift, more of us are able to go on holiday. As those who've been shielding, many of them are able to come out from the beginning of August. It feels as though we're beginning to enter this new life, this new era. We're even able to worship together in church buildings again. It's not quite the promised land that we're going into, but nor have we had 40 years in the wilderness. And we know that these new freedoms are going to bring new dangers. You know, we could get complacent about washing our hands or keeping social distance. We could have second waves of coronavirus or local lockdowns and so on. And Moses knew that the new opportunities and the new freedoms brought their own dangers and temptations too. And so just as our government has put in place things like masks to mitigate against the risks, so God through Moses was putting in place things to mitigate against the risks that they faced as they went into the new land. You see, God knew that those people would be tempted to think they'd almost entered the promised land in their own strength. And so he said, look, the first thing I want you to do in the new land is build an altar to God to remind you that it was me who brought you here. And then God knew that once they'd started harvesting their magnificent crops in this new fruitful land, they'd be tempted to think it was all just the fruit of their own hard work. And so God gets them to present the first fruits of their crops as a sacrifice to him, as a reminder that actually this is still God's gift to them. And God knew that when they settled down in the new land and had their families and so on, they might forget who he'd called them to be and how he wanted them to live. And so he told them to write the new laws on stone and to read them out regularly. And God knew that as they went into this new normal way of life, they'd forget maybe that their spiritual health was, well, it wasn't just a sort of optional extra, but actually it was a matter of life and death. And so he got the people to stand and to pronounce God's blessings, to remind them of God's blessings on those who follow God and God's curses on those who choose to disobey God. Now, all of that had happened in the few chapters leading up to this reading, which Anna just read for us. And in this chapter, Moses gives this simple choice before the nation. It's the climax of Moses's last and greatest speech. And he says they can either choose life or they can choose death. And as he unpacks that a little bit more, it becomes clear what the heart of the choice is and what the consequences of that choice is. You see, on the one hand, he says they could choose to love the Lord their God, the faithful, promise-keeping, generous, loving, holy, all-powerful God who's brought them into the promised land. And he says that those who choose to love God will choose to obey what he says and listen to his commands and keep them. And God says that the reward, the consequence for those who choose to love him and obey him is blessing and prosperity. Their life and their work will flourish. But on the other hand, he says, you could choose to be drawn away and to love other things more than God. Your family, your career, your hobbies, your box sets, your holidays, your bank balance. And he says that if you choose to love those other things more than God, then when push comes to shove, sometimes you will choose to disobey God. And he says those who head out down that path, the consequence actually is destruction and experiencing God's curse. So one is the way to life and the other is the way to death. And so as they stand on the verge of this new era, Moses is really clear about this choice that they face. And at root, he says, it's a question of the heart. Either they choose to love the Lord their God with their hearts, or they choose to love other things more. And the former generation had chosen badly, hadn't they? And they'd spent 40 years experiencing God's curse. They'd chosen to go away from God. And Moses is urging this generation, look, don't repeat the mistake that your parents made. Choose life so that you and your children may live. And as a pastor, I have seen time and again that any significant change in life, whether it's changing school or changing work or starting a relationship or getting married or having children or finishing a relationship or changing job or retiring, any of these things has a deeper choice underneath it. It's not just who or where or when. Actually, there's a choice about where God is going to fit in to this new situation that we find ourselves in. Are we going to choose to live for God in this new stage of life, or are we not? And you see, it's not just Moses who laid down that challenge thousands of years ago for the Hebrew people. Actually, Jesus lays down the same challenge to us. In Jesus' most famous sermon, he said this, enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it, but small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. So it's the same sort of choice, isn't it? Destruction or life. And he ups the ante. He points out that most people choose the easier path, which doesn't have a happy ending. Only a few people choose the more difficult path, the path to life. And so whenever we face a transition in life, Jesus urges us, choose life. Choose loving God, even when it's difficult. Choose keep pursuing God, even when many other things and people vie for our attention. Choose obeying God, even when it means sacrifice or ridicule. Small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life. But choose that gate, choose that road, choose life. I find it sobering that Moses says, choose life that you and your children may live. He's pointing out that those of us who are parents, that the decisions and choices we make have a massive impact on our children. Of course, we know that at the practical level, if we move house or change job or whatever, it's going to have a knock-on effect to the family. But he's saying it's true at the spiritual level as well. If we choose to love other things more than God, if we choose the broad gate and follow that path through life, well, that leaves a significant negative spiritual legacy on our children. And it makes it much harder for them to follow God. Not impossible, of course, but harder. And those who choose life and choose the narrow gate and choose loving God over other things, that leaves a really positive spiritual legacy in our children, which means it's much less likely that they're going to choose to go the other way later on. Not impossible for them, of course, but less likely. Now, a couple of months ago, when we were in the middle of lockdown, I talked about some of the surprising opportunities that open up even in the midst of the crisis. Now that we're coming out of lockdown, I want to talk about some of the risks that there are, the dangers, as we enter this new era. Not the physical dangers, but the spiritual ones. You see, just as Moses knew there were going to be lots of challenges as well as opportunities in the promised land, we can see that there's lots of dangers as well as opportunities in this new era that we're going into. And I'm not claiming that this list is definitive, but these are just some of the things that I see that we face, the challenges. You see, like the Hebrew people, we could become complacent in our relationship with God. In their desert experience, the people have been forced to rely on God more. And that's been true for many of us, hasn't it? In lockdown, people have told me they've been praying more or they've been reading the Bible more. Wonderful. But it'd be easy as life begins to return to something that feels a bit more normal for the greater praying and the greater Bible reading just to slip out of the window. As life gets busier, those things get squeezed out. So what are we going to do to mitigate against that danger? And there are other people who've talked to me, not about necessarily about praying for longer, but praying in a deeper way. It's as though they've discovered new ways of praying, new spiritual muscles, prayer muscles. And it's been a bit painful to exercise them at first, but learning to lament, learning to really intercede, to pray hard for other people, learning to confess. These new ways of praying that people have discovered, and actually it'd be easy to forget about those and let those spiritual muscles get flabby again. What are we going to do to mitigate it against that risk that we lose track on our spiritual life? And then, of course, there's many people who've discovered that doing church at home is far more convenient than going to the building. I had to put on my coat. I got wet going to church this morning. That doesn't happen when you stay at home, does it? At home, you can watch church in your PJs. You can do something else at the same time. It doesn't matter if the kids go in and out and so on. We can watch at a time to suit us. It's very convenient, but actually it's not the full church experience. Yes, it's been essential over these last few months, but it's not the genuine full experience of being with other people. And if in a few months' time, when we're all allowed to go back to the building and it's safe for us all to do so, if you're tempted still just to tune in online when you could actually have gone to the building, well, you'll be missing out. So how can we mitigate against that risk in the new era? And Moses says, choose life, that you and your children may live and that you may love the Lord your God. Listen to his voice and hold fast to him, for the Lord is your life. Jesus says, enter through the narrow gate. Small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. And so as we come out of lockdown, we have these decisions to make, to choose the way of life, or to choose other things over God. Which way are you going to go? And then which way are we going to go as a whole church community together? What are the challenges we face as a church community as we begin to enter this new era? Well, one temptation when we're able to go back into the building and so on is just to press rewind, to sort of take everything back to exactly what it was 6 months ago, to do church life in the same way with all the same activities. But actually, to do that would be to ignore that society has changed over the last 6 months, to ignore that we have changed. And so it wouldn't be right simply to press rewind and to do all the same things in exactly the same way. We need to change and adapt. And the opposite temptation would be to fast forward and to rush into the new future as quickly as possible and say, look, there's so many new opportunities and so much has changed. We need to crack on and be with it in this new era. But friends, that could spell disaster for us, and we would certainly burn out. And so as I've prayed about it over these last few weeks, and as we've shared with the leadership and as they've been feeding into me and so on, it's become clear to us that what we need to do to mitigate against either the risk of going fast forward or going rewind is to press pause. Pause. And so many of us are exhausted that these summer months need to be a time of rest. Just pausing, resting in God, resting in who God has made us to be. And once we've finished our series in Colossians, we're going to spend some time thinking about what it means to rest in God. And then when it comes to the autumn, instead of having lots of activity, as we often do in the autumn season, it's going to be a period of listening to God, hearing him and what his will is for our future as a church. Moses spells out what's involved, doesn't he? He says, the walk of faith boils down to loving God, listening to God, and holding fast to him. And so in the autumn, we're going to focus on going deeper in our love for God, listening carefully for his guiding voice about what his will is for us in the future. And I pray that we will have the courage to hold fast to whatever he says to us. Back at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned the film Trainspotting, and mostly the mugs and the posters and so on finished that long famous quote with the words "choose life." But actually in the film, the character went on to say this: but why would I want to do a thing like that? I choose not to choose life. I choose something else. And that was the mistake that the Hebrew people had made in the wilderness. They had chosen the broad gate, the path that leads to death and destruction. And Moses urged this new generation on the brink of the promised land to choose the narrow gate, to choose life. He put in place lots of safeguards to help them choose life and to continue to choose life as they went forward into their new era. And as we stand on the brink of this new era, as lockdown begins to lift, let's choose life, so that we and our children may discover life, and that we may love the Lord our God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. For the Lord is our life. Let me pray for us. Lord Jesus, you present us with this stark choice, choosing life or death. It doesn't always seem that clear to us, but thank you that you have made it a stark choice so that we can see the implications, the consequences of each of our decisions in life. I pray that you would help each of us as we go through this transition into a new era, and help those especially who are facing new challenges and transitions in new jobs or new homes or new schools. Help each of us to choose you, to choose loving you, listening to you, holding fast to you, that we may choose the way of life. Fill us with your Spirit to enable us to do that to your glory. Amen.